button. There we go. Welcome everyone to Making the Familiar Strange. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and I'm glad that you were all able to join us for today's presentation, which will be led by Deb McCollister. I'll introduce her a little bit more in a moment, but for right now, my name is ZimmerMas, and I'm Tri-Faith's Education and Program Associate. In this program of Making the Familiar Strange, I'm here to welcome you, remind you of how the program works, and assist our special guests in whatever ways they might prefer.
Oh, that's just, she said that was your idea. I think it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of.
It looks like we've got there we go. So remember that the goals for this program are to take a new look at Abrahamic stories together, and to also take on new perspectives by looking at familiar or sometimes less familiar stories with fresh eyes and new points of view. So today, of course, as I mentioned, we're delighted to be joined by Deb McCollister of Countryside, who's going to share her perspective on the story of the Samaritan woman at the well in the Gospel of John. So remember that our ground rules are to be respectful, to reconsider what assumptions you might be bringing to this story, to speak from your own point of view rather than on behalf of a larger group of people. So remember using those I statements. And keep in mind that when we look at these nuanced stories, we're all trying to hear and consider a new perspective that might be a little bit different from our own, and it's okay if we don't completely agree with it. There we go. So next month, we're going to be joined on April 19th by Ramazan Kilinch, who will be sharing about a Muslim perspective on sacrifice in the Quran. You can find more details about that and register for that program on our website, trifaith.org/events. For today, as we are preparing to hear Deb's perspective, just to let you know, she's asked me to watch the chat for her and to let her know about any questions or comments that people post in there, especially when she opens things up for discussion. At those points, please feel free to participate in whatever way or ways are the most comfortable to you, whether that's through the chat, unmuting yourself, or a combination of those things. And Deb has emphasized to me that she's very flexible about how people like to participate. So please don't be afraid to get involved in the conversation. Now, Deb, I will hand things over to you to introduce yourself and get us started on this topic.
Okay, let's see if I'm smart enough to share my screen. Yeah, there we go. So far, so good. I chose this story because I struggled with it when I wanted to present it to Sunday school students, so elementary school students. I work with a group of people and we write Sunday school curriculum, our own curriculum, so that we can dig a little deeper than most canned curriculums go. So this one was a struggle. And then there are theologians that I read that I find enlightening. So this is also, everyone, let me apologize. I didn't consider when I chose it how long the scripture reading is and how much we need to hear most of it. So I have many slides with this, and I'm going to ask you to read individual slides if you would be kind enough to volunteer so you don't have to hear my voice the whole time. Okay, now I just discovered that I can't advance my slides. Why is that? Okay, there we go. I hope this works. So the context for choosing it, as I said, I had talked about it with our Sunday school class. Jeremy, I think a month ago, did a presentation on the division between the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom, the Samaritans and the Jews, as it were. So that provides us a little more background, and I had to kind of clean up my presentation considering what Jeremy had said. Okay, now, why can't I advance my slides? Somebody, remote control? I don't have a remote.
If you hover over lower right.
Oh, there, it's different than it is when I'm just doing it on my own. So the book of John has always been troubling to me. It's been interpreted as anti-Semitic, and I have certainly read it that way. It can be accused of presenting Christian superiority and exclusivity. And as a lay nerd, I'm always intrigued by those questions. But what I've come to understand over the past several years is the book of John is so metaphorical. It is not as the other early texts of what we call the New Testament are. And Amy Jill Levine pointed out to me that it has deep mystical Jewish roots. So I think that context is helpful and important in considering this story. And I loved it with the kids because there are so many barriers that are broken through this story. And I think that's fun for children. So New Testament chronology. We know that scholars place Jesus' death about 30 in the Christian era. And the first written materials that we find in the New Testament are from the Apostle Paul, who never knew Jesus, who we think those letters were written roughly between 45 and 70 in the Christian era. So that makes those recollections based very heavily on an oral tradition before they were ever written. And then we have what we call the Synoptic Gospels. Mark came to be written about between 66 and 74, the Christian era. And then both Matthew and Luke between 80 and 90, and they draw heavily upon the book of Mark. We're certain because of the way certain stories are written that Matthew and Luke could see what was before them in the book of Mark. And they also had a third source, we believe, or a second source, which we call Q. It's been lost to us, but the similarities in Matthew and Luke drawing from some other source are nerdishly interesting to me. So John was the last of the Gospels to be written, and not until about 85, between 85 and 100 in the Christian era. So that is so much later than the life of Jesus. So it deals with a lot of reflection. So we can say that we understand now that biblical texts speak in multiple voices, in multiple contexts, because they were written at various times. And, you know, in the last 100, 200 years, we've discovered more about when those were likely to have been written. And so that has changed the perception of the role of scripture and how it speaks to us. It's not a historical document in the context that we Westerners think of history, where it's a iron-tight recitation of facts. So Paul's writings were mostly letters of advice to what were then called followers of the way, the Jesus followers. And they were trying to live, for the most part, a Jewish life and just considering the Jesus message a new revelation of their deep commitment to Judaism. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke were the narrative story of Jesus' life. We call that the synoptic tradition. So it's not history as we know it, but it is, you could say that it's history in the sense that it was understood at that point, which had a lot to do with an epic story, what's meaning, and later what was accepted theology. And so then those same texts are read with that effort or that vision in mind. John is written in such a metaphorical and symbolic way. So we've had fun in our Sunday school class the last several weeks, taking stories from John and asking the kids to find the metaphors and find the symbols. And we did ciphers and secret codes. What is this really trying to tell us, to try to uncover that? So we know the authors, and this is a misconception that I think Christians held for many, many years. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, well, those are names of apostles, disciples of Jesus, but they were not formally educated. They spoke Aramaic, and we know now by the dating of the Gospels, by historical events that occurred after the death of those people, they couldn't have been written by those people because those events hadn't happened yet, that they were written in very correct Greek. So we know that all those stories of Jesus were first shared in the oral tradition. And that's why John is so distinct and so very different. There are so many clues that it was not even attempting to be history. So as we go through, I'm going to make you torturously read through all this biblical text. Jot down, grab a pencil and just jot down any of the societal barriers that you perceive being challenged through this telling of this story. And I think that's kind of fun. Okay, I'm going to read the first one, and then I'm going to ask for volunteers. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away to the city to buy food. So the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, though you are a Jew, are asking me for a drink, though I am a Samaritan woman?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. And Jesus replied to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." Okay, do we have a volunteer to read this slide?
I'll volunteer, Deb.
Oh, thank you.
She's okay. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw water." He said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said to him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You have correctly said, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This which you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and yet you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one must worship."
Wonderful. Okay, going further, and we'll come back to various points in these. Another volunteer.
I'll volunteer, Marcia.
Thank you, Marcia. 'Cause I look forward to you.
Jesus said to her, "Believe me, woman, that a time is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, because salvation is from the Jews. But a time is coming, and even now has arrived, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us." Jesus said to her, "I am he, the one speaking to you."
All right, thank you. That was long. Okay, one more.
I'll do it, Deb.
Thank you, Abdul.
And at this point, his disciples came and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman. Yet no one said, "What are you seeking?" or "Why are you speaking with her?" So the woman left the water pot and went into the city and said to the people, "Come see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is he?" They left the city and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat something." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples were saying to one another, "No one brought him anything to eat, did he?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work."
Thank you. Okay, so just a brief recollection of Jeremy's presentation several weeks ago, that Samaria was in the northern kingdom and Jerusalem and Judah was the southern kingdom. And we're going to come back to that. So what Samaritan, we talked about this in Jeremy's presentation, but we know that when the Israelites entered the promised land, that region in the north was allotted to the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, and Assyrians conquered that region about 720 BCE, and Samaritans intermarried. They survived there. They held on to Jewish roots and yet were seen as accommodating. The the religions of spouses and the religions of the people around them. So there was consideration by those in the southern kingdom that the Samaritans were lax in their worship of God. And many from the southern kingdom would do anything to avoid traveling through Samaria because it just wasn't friendly. So they would skirt the vicinity and go out of their way to travel further away, or to avoid going through that land. So thoughts on that? Anyone? Okay, so that's a background for this. And then the whole issue of women, and this is probably why I'm attracted to this story. We know that men did not interact with women who were not their spouses or family members. So that right away, that Jesus starts a conversation with a woman, is breaking a barrier. The women of villages typically all went to the well at the same time, generally early in the morning and late afternoon when it was cooler. So the fact that we see this woman at the well alone at noon is highly symbolic of her alienation from the community. Why would she not be participating with the other women in the village? Because that was their socialization. And given the story of the husbands, we might surmise that she's not just any woman, but that she's viewed as tainted. Now, we don't really know. Judy Weibel preached a sermon on this passage Sunday, which made me very concerned about where I was going. Judy, you can pipe in, but we don't really have indication in that scripture that why she had 5 husbands. Was she a wanton woman? Had she been divorced, or did husbands die and she remarried? Widows remarried? We don't really know, but we do know that she's there alone in the middle of the day. So something is up. Nevertheless, I love reading this again with eyes that say that was a very respectful exchange between Jesus and this woman. And she was not laying down and rolling over. She banters with him. And you can contrast that, and we'll come to this again, with the male disciples. Toward the end of the story, when he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about, and they still didn't get it. But she seemed to kick into understanding the symbolism of living water sooner than the male disciples did. So that's an interesting take on whomever the author of John was. And we do believe there were there were at least 3, perhaps 4 different authors of the book of John based on the dialectical styles of what's written. So I'm just curious about others of you in the group, what struck you about the interaction between Jesus and the woman? Anybody?
I think, like with many other people that were outcasts or not included, he was inclusive. There were not the typical you're in or you're out. There weren't those exclusive boundaries of who could be with Jesus.
I like that.
That sense of inclusivity with everyone.
With everyone. Anybody else?
Well, you know, Deb, that I have a few other ideas about this.
I know you do.
I think the whole thing about the woman at the well not being there when all the other women are there has branded her over the centuries.
Yeah, I do too.
And it could be she was late, she was having a bad day, who knows. We're very quick to jump to conclusions, I think, about other people's lives without having good evidence. And even if she were what they were saying she was, still even more important than perhaps.
Yeah.
Jesus, I don't know. I don't picture him just sidling up to anybody. I think, that he intentionally started that conversation. Just that he did that is amazing.
Yes, it is. To
And
me,
that he-
that is just astonishing.
Yeah.
And whether that actually historically occurred that way, to me, and this is how I still call myself a Christian, even though I question so many things, that the people who were reflecting on how he had shaped their lives
Yes.
made that proclamation. And they felt that so strongly so to me, that had to be an overwhelming part of the narrative. I like that. Yeah, go ahead.
So there's something in this story that I wish was different. And instead of Jesus saying to the woman, "Give me water," I wish he would have just offered her water. And I actually imagine that is how the story went. I don't know why.
Okay.
It's a different era, but just the male saying to the female, "Give me water," just rubs me wrong. And so I have to imagine Jesus offers her water and strikes up the conversation.
She was the one with the bucket. I love that part.
Okay.
I have no bucket. You have no bucket. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, sometimes I think about it, if we're thinking about it in those terms, every part of this was dangerous for her to be at the well by herself, for a man to talk to her while she's by herself that she's unrelated to. So maybe asking her for water was the safest way that he could talk to her without seeming very threatening.
Ooh, that's great. I never
is
thought
great.
of that. I love that.
This has always been one of my favorite passages. And I had just heard someone say, Jesus said, "Give me water," because he was thirsting for her faith.
Ooh,
And so to look at that way, that was really something different.
that is something different, Marianne. That's lovely. Okay, so he was speaking to a Samaritan. He was conversing with a woman. I love that she holds her own in that banter with him, that she's not presented as needing his edification so much as she is on equal ground, I think. But that's my interpretation as a 21st century feminist. And that Jesus is, okay, I'm not advancing, is so respectful of her. And I think Judy pointed that out this weekend in her sermon as well. He sees her. He sees deep into her and knew that he could have that conversation with him. And so the passage is, she said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket and the well is deep. Where then do you get this living water? You're not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle." So that leads me to the next little nerdish thing that I love. I had not considered this, so this is stolen from other commentators, but the well as a marriage motif. And we see so many marriage motifs in the life of Jesus, but that we know that Abraham's servant used the very same words at a well, and he went there. Do you remember what Abraham was sent to do? He was sent to find a wife for Isaac. And so he inquires of a servant and had told himself that if that servant answered in a certain way, he would know he was finding a wife, finding Rebecca. And then again, we know Jacob's well, when Jacob was fleeing Esau and meets Rachel. So again, the bridegroom bride motif. Moses meeting the daughters of the Midian priest at the well. Not quite the same thing, but later Moses goes on to marry Zipporah through that story. So we see Jesus cast as a bridegroom. And if you really want to push it, is he inviting Samaria to a marriage? So Marcia had said earlier, the inclusivity that we see in the ministry of Jesus, there were barriers being.
Yeah, I got a question.
Yeah.
Okay. weren't all prophets inclusive to women and spoke to women? I know in our tradition, they all reached out to people, and, there was no indication that any, of the, prophets in our faith excluded women at all. So I find this, kind of
pushing it.
No.
I think in Christianity, and maybe it's not scriptural, it's tradition that, there are very few women actually named in the Bible compared to how many men are named, even when their roles are pretty significant.
Okay.
So we, that I think that contrasts here, but what do the rest of you think? There isn't a right answer there.
Just curious on my
Yeah,
end.
no, I think it's a good point.
I really love the marriage analogy. I had never thought about that story in this context before.
Yeah, I hadn't either. It seemed pushing it, but it is interesting. Anybody else? And it kind of fits with, at the time John was written. So John didn't get written till much, much later, the last to be written. And the followers of what we call the way, Jesus' path, living as Jesus led them to live, in the very beginning, just saw themselves as another manifestation of Judaism. There were many different types of Judaism practiced, and this seemed to be part of that stream. But as time went on and there was more including of Gentiles into those communities, I can see the bridegroom motif being expanded, that more are invited to this family that Jesus is speaking of.
It would also, Deb, support the allegory theory that we were talking about, that being one of the explanations. If you're talking about him inviting Samaria, not the woman, but Samaria,
not the woman, but it's,
to leave behind their 5 gods,
right,
and pick it up there, that would support that. But I hadn't thought of it
that way. Well, that was not my original thought. I'm trying to remember whose that was. It was either
well, the Jewish Sabbath is seen as a bride. When we welcome the Sabbath, we welcome a bride. So, having a marriage motif in the well isn't outside of the realm of possibility, considering how we look at the Sabbath.
Yeah, and you look at those other stories that led to actual marriage for Jacob and Isaac. Ooh. Okay. And then we consider, we said that the well is a motif. Call your husband. And I love this. Judy pointed out Sunday, and this was a part I hadn't thought about. So thank you, Judy, that he does not accuse her of being a wanton woman. That's probably later patriarchal church leaders who wanted to do that. But she volunteers that information. So she is being quite authentic and honest. I have no husband. And Jesus said to her, you've correctly said that, I have no husband. So that typically in my childhood was interpreted as Jesus is prescient. He knows everything about everything. But if we read this as followers of Jesus trying to present a story of inclusivity, I don't know, does that change it for anybody else? That tweaked it for me. I guess that was a yes/no question. That's not a good open-ended question. Okay, and the whole spiritual waters, I found interesting that this is living water. And again, I think I pointed that out earlier. I think this last passage was added to contrast that even his students who had been with him for some time were still in the concrete, and this was speaking about spiritual water, not actual water or actual food. Judy, you have any thoughts about that?
I definitely thought it was spiritual water, living, loving water.
Right,
It
but I
was
meant
not-
the contrast.
Was not in the well.
The male disciples and the female at the well.
Yeah.
The other point that hit me is that this woman is really presented as the first evangelist.
Mhm.
She's the one who went back to the village, left her water pot, and said to the people, "Come see a man who told me all the things I have done." And she interprets him, as does the author of John, as this is who we've been waiting for. This is something more than a regular teacher.
And he says to her, I am he.
I am
He
he.
doesn't say that in a lot of places.
No, he doesn't. And that's also, to me, very interesting. And that's where I have had a problem with the book of John in my life, because there are a number of those kinds of references where Jesus does claim to be part of God, to be the Son of God. In other Gospels, it's referred to as, he refers to himself as the Son of Man, which was a term that could apply to all humanity, that God created us. The first man was Adam, and so the linguistic connections are there. But in the book of John, it's why I think we understand the book of John is metaphorical and symbolic, and sharing the faith that those authors had about something that was just really bringing them alive.
Deb, from what you've talked about, it sounds like this, the book of John is almost meant to go further and evangelize new groups. And so it's specifically saying that, yes, I am he, and I am inviting Samaritans and others to join in this bigger context, and that it was written later. So it might not have been exactly what he said, but it's the author's way of saying, this is who he is, and come join. This is the Christ.
Yeah. Anybody else? I mean, that, Marcia, that reflects me, but that doesn't mean that's the
You just
only
had a
one.
list of items on there, Deb.
Yes, I
You
did.
changed it.
Yeah,
It
no, I
said
went
something
back.
about allows
Yeah,
this
it-
uppity woman.
Yeah,
What makes her uppity?
that she speaks back to him. She questions him. She challenges him. What do you mean? You don't even have a bucket. She doesn't just comply.
Yeah, I know.
That's how I see uppity
Mhm.
in the context of the period. I just think that author, or whomever wrote this particular
Mhm.
story, just really pulls together a lot of various strains, setting it at Jacob's well, having her there at noon for whatever reason, whatever, it's a little bit outside the norm. And the other thing that somebody pointed out to me, that this is the longest conversation between Jesus and anybody in the Gospels. That's fascinating.
Because he was talking to a woman.
Because he was talking to a woman. Well, I need to go back and count how many.
Do not
words.
report I said that. But he allows this confident woman,
This confident
this
woman.
unintimidated woman.
Yeah, she's not intimidated.
Yeah.
Yes.
Words are important to me.
Yeah, you don't like uppity. Okay.
Could she have gone to the well at noon because she was really tired of all the gossip
It
in the
could
morning?
be.
And just like, oh my God, I need silence when I get my water, please. Just shut up. I
I'll
don't need
sweat
to
a
hear
little.
about what everyone's brother, sister, uncle is doing. Just enough.
Yeah, that could very well be, which also puts her into another category, I suppose.
Could it also
Doesn't
be,
care for the trivial.
could it also be, Deb, that her comfort level with bantering with Jesus wasn't so much about her confidence level as about Jesus' ability to make her feel comfortable?
Ooh, that's
You know?
lovely. Because he is treating her respectfully,
Mhm.
you know, in that interaction with her. He's not saying, okay, come on, don't you get it?
Yeah, so my view of that is it's less about who she is and more about
More
who
about-
Jesus was.
Which is always what I think the point of scripture is, to try to reveal to us who God is. Or in this case, who Jesus is and what that power is. Ooh, that was good.
I found another very interesting, to me, sentence that I had never noticed before, and that's going all the way back to verse 4. As your list is up here, I think maybe it would be before the other things. It says, but Jesus had to go through Samaria.
Ooh,
Why did he have to go
Why
through
did he
Samaria?
have to?
Said who? There's something else happening here. There's some
oh,
other
that is
maybe
good.
divine intention setting this story off.
Which again fits with the book of John. Sorry, I was trying to get to the verse, so I'm not that smart. Oh, that is good. How are we doing on time? Ooh, this is faster than I thought. So I agree with those who say that the book of John presents Jesus a bit differently, not as, in no way as a visitor from another realm, but as a person in whom a new God consciousness, a new awareness, a new oneness or synchronicity had emerged. We have so many stories where Jesus goes off by himself to pray and to get centered, or that's how I think of it, as getting centered, and then comes back renewed. So this characterization is.
And Deb, while you've got a pause in there, I want to mention something from the chat that just popped in from Olivia, who says, speaking of her comfort level and inclusivity, Jesus, via respect, created a, quote, psychologically safe space for the woman to engage / speak confidently / truthfully.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Olivia. That fits with board training that we had at Tri-Faith about psychologically safe spaces for sharing and being able to speak your truth. That's great. And this is, yeah, I rather like Bishop Spong, who just died this past year. But he wrote, he goes through a whole evolution on the book of John. And his quote that I loved was that, I find this gospel to be a book not about religion, sin, and salvation, which I would say is how our dominant Western Christian institutions have often presented that we are the way, you know, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, meaning it's the only way you can get to God. But if you understand it more about internalizing this love from God, it's not so much about sin and salvation, but about expanded life, expanded consciousness, living fully with God. That's the end of my dog and pony show, but we can talk. Anything else in the chat, Allie?
It seems like this group was a lot more comfortable speaking out loud than some of the groups we've had in programs in the past. So most of the contributions have just been out loud. But I also want to take this opportunity to thank you, Deb, for your presentation and for leading us all in that conversation about your perspective and their perspectives on this story. So thank you so much for such an engaging presentation and such interesting conversation topics. And yeah,
I'm going to
give it
steal
back to
some
you
of this.
for concluding. Yeah, if there are any other topics that people want to discuss, or Deb, if you have any other questions for the group or anything like that, I think this would be a great time since we do have a few extra minutes.
I'll pipe in to do a shameless plug. Deb,
Yeah.
first, thank you.
Hi, Wendy.
It was fun to listen and to have you as our teacher. Thank you for being that today. I wanted to remind you that we have a program on Thursday at noon with Lucinda Mosier. She is with Hartman Institute in Connecticut, and we will be discussing her companion guidebook on interreligious studies. And I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to take on reading a 500-page textbook in preparation for bringing a speaker, but I will tell you, it is an incredibly rich document. It's not out yet, so we'll be able to have a pre-conversation with her. And Lucinda is really an important name in interreligious interfaith work. And so many of the people whose voices are part of this companion guide are the thought leaders that we all look to as this work unfolds in our country and globally. So noon to 1 o'clock on Thursday.
Wendy, is that Hartman related to the Israeli Hartman Center?
No. This used to be Hartford Seminary, and
Hartford. I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
Seminary, and I probably said it wrong.
No,
and then they just rebranded to be more of an institute for religious understanding and peace, and have extended beyond seminary alone in terms of the graduate studies that they offer.
Okay.
She's also one of the editors of the Journal for Interreligious Studies, and has written just dozens and dozens of books. So I really think it'll be an interesting conversation. I hope that you all check us out. And then I believe, Allie, did you put a link in for a survey so we could get some feedback on today? I think that would be great to hear from all of you.
Yes, and I'm putting that in one more time now. Thank you for the reminder there. I was just about to pop back.
Mary has something to say.
Yes, I feel like we're kind of signing off on this presentation more quickly than perhaps we need to. I just wanted to say how much I appreciated the not only Deb's study, but the study of many others underneath what she has shared with us today. And, you know, while I identify myself as Christian, given my upbringing, I have too evolved to a place where I don't think as exclusively as I think many Christians tend to think and express themselves. And I had never thought about many of the things that came up in today's conversation. I mean, I just haven't been in a dialogue with others that has even broached some of the ideas that came forth today, not only from Deb, but also from Judith and Karen and others. And I just, yeah, I'm sure there are more layers to be peeled away, even as we speak with each other right now before we sign off. So I'm curious about others' reactions. Maybe you're much more steeped than I in the story of the woman at the well and some of the other implications that came up. But I just didn't want us to close down too quickly.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
There may be some other.
I found one more tidbit that I forgot to mention that didn't come from me, but one scholar also suggested that the implication of the woman having been divorced many times, it's not said in the text, but that's an implication, reflects the divorce between the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. I thought that may be a stretch, but it's provocative in my mind.
Going with that theme, my thought went to, if this is a marriage invitation and Jesus mentioned 5, were there 5 false prophets or things that Samaritans had in their history? And now we're following a different one. And it would be interesting to look at that history and see if that correlated.
Judy, take it away, because you mentioned that Sunday.
It was one suggestion when I was doing research on the woman at the well. It was one suggestion that this story is an allegory and that the woman doesn't have a name because in fact she represents Samaria, and the 5 husbands are the 5 gods that they worshipped. And the husband she mentions that Jesus mentions is not her husband now, might be God, Yahweh, that she worships in ignorance. So that the allegory covered all of that.
I think that's really fun.
That was one option.
I hadn't found that one, but I loved it.
Yeah. So, and the other, I won't tell you what a good girl I was yesterday. When I was doing the original research on this, there was one pastor who had some really unkind things to say. So yesterday, I think at one point I said, he even called her later in his sermon, and I paused and I said, very mean word. Because he called her a whore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't want to say that in front of the kids.
Yeah.
But so there have been some really awful sermons from Christian pastors about this woman.
And about many women. I mean, that we get Mary Magdalene cast as a whore.
Sure. Yeah. A prostitute too. Big on prostitution. And in the post-sermon dialogue, the first thing people were saying is how bad she was if they thought she was a prostitute. There's no mention of the people who hired her or used her service had she been. So they were getting a little hot under the collar on that. So I tried to move it along.
And I would just like to say, if anybody, your interest has been piqued to hear Judy's sermon, it's on the Countryside website.
Yeah.
So you can go there.
That.
And I highly recommend you do.
And Lee just raised your hand. Lee, hi. I haven't seen you since COVID.
I know. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Good to see you.
Okay.
I was just kind of thinking, I am Jewish, but I was thinking if she does not go in the typical times for women to go to the well, and she is there speaking to Jesus in kind of a very personal way that does not reflect the norm of the way you might speak to Jesus. And he speaks to her more than he speaks to anybody in the New Testament. And they're at this place of living waters, that this is an extremely spiritual encounter and reality and very personal, one-on-one. So I can see it in that way.
Lovely.
Looking at my screen trying to find the person that was just speaking. So I was not familiar with everyone. One of the things that just from a observational level that I find fascinating is in this conversation, and I'm sure in conversations among others who are probing and exploring, is there's no sense of declaring which is truth and which isn't, that it's all kind of a spirit of inquiry and interpretation, that the initial acknowledgement, and I think Deb said this, is that there are no answers, there are no right answers. So there's all this kind of interpretive learning that happens with various interpretations. And the other thing that I'm noticing is the intrigue that the story still holds, even though there's all these various ways of looking at it and understanding it and how what this might mean and what that symbol might mean and so on. That even without that certainty, it still has a captivating effect for all these many centuries.
Yeah.
So anyway, just a couple of observations. Who is the person that just spoke? Is that?
It was Lee Needleman.
Okay.
That would be me.
That would be
Hello.
Lee.
There you are. Oh, there it says Laura Lee. That's why I was confused.
Okay.
I'm looking for it. I don't know most of you. So.
You would like her, Mary.
Thanks, Deb. I like you too.
As long as we're talking metaphorically, this is a story about tri-faith, right? It's instead of pointing at they who we don't know, have never met, it's a story about interpersonal dialogue with somebody and what can actually happen when you actually have a real conversation with somebody.
I love it.
And how that can progress forward. And so it says something to me about the types of things that we have here. A great way to spend a lunch hour.
Thank you, Jim.
Yes, and authenticity, that they're speaking honestly and forthrightly and not camouflaging.
I can say that, unlike Wendy, and not have to call it a shameless plug.
Yeah. Well, shameless plugs are good things too. So all of it is well by me. Speak only for myself.
I would add on to that to say that so much of what I loved about the conversation today was the ability to question and be curious and to look at something differently. And that's the place that I would agree that we really are seeking to reach to, because there's just such a world where that's not celebrated.
Yeah. And we've so longed, at least I label this with dominant Christianity, use those scriptures as weapons or as power tools to dominate someone somewhere, as opposed to, in this story, the authentic spiritual enlivening of people. A personal invitation that expands to community is different than hammering someone over the head with rules that they may be breaking.
And I think today was really a gathering for all of us at the well.
Nice, Connie. Well, thank you all. I'm afraid I don't have a big conclusion, so.
Thanks, Deb.
Appreciated this. This was fun.
I think your quote from the bishop was a lovely conclusion. The one that
Thank you. I do love that man.
Thank you again. And don't forget to fill out the survey, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon. And we appreciate your time and joining us over this lunch hour.
Thank you. Oh, bye. Oh, look who we were with, Lee.